The bitterness of the Ozark Hills in late October is not the kind that announces itself. It does not arrive with wind or drama. It does not send ahead the theater of a storm front building on the horizon or the dramatic drop in pressure that makes animals restless and old joints ache with prophecy. It settles. It moves into the low places, first the creek hollows, the shaded north-facing slopes where the sun has not touched the ground since September, and it waits there with the patience of something that knows it will win eventually. The trees feel it before the people do. The oaks go copper and rust. The hickories drop their leaves without ceremony, one at a time, as if releasing a grip they have been maintaining since April and have finally decided to let go. And the red clay earth, which has spent all summer burning under a Missouri sun, begins to close in on itself, hardening at the surface while something deep and ancient and unchanged keeps its own temperature far below. Cordelia Vance understood this about the earth before she understood much else. She had been born 58 years earlier in a log house not 10 miles from where she now stood to a father who could read the land the way other men read newspapers, with attention, with skepticism, with the understanding that what was printed on the surface was only part of the story. Her mother had been a woman of the preserved and the put-up of the sealed jar and the salted crock of the deep pantry and the careful inventory taken every January to see what was left and what the spring would require. The Ozarks had taught Cora everything it teaches the people who stay long enough to listen, that the surface of things lies that depth is where the truth is kept, and that a woman who plans in August will eat in February. She was standing at the top of a low hill on the 40 acres her husband Amos had worked for 11 years. Amos was 4 months dead. The grief was not theatrical. It had never been that kind. It was the grief of someone who had built a life with another person over decades, who had learned the specific rhythms of that person, the way he took his coffee, the sound of his boots on the plank floor in the morning, the particular silence of a man thinking through a problem before he was ready to speak about it, and who now moved through a world where those rhythms were absent and nothing had replaced them. There was no replacing them. You simply learned to move through the spaces they had occupied. You learned to hear the silence without flinching. It took longer than most people who had not experienced it would expect. The accident had happened the way accidents always happen in working country, fast and without warning, and in the presence of other people who were powerless to stop it. The gears of a corn mill, a sleeve caught wrong at the wrong moment in the wrong way. The men who were there said it was over before anyone understood what was happening. They said Amos didn't scream. They said he was gone in the time it takes to draw a single breath and understand that you have drawn it. The mill owner had paid for the burial. Not out of obligation, the law in that county in 1884 did not require him to, but out of the particular guilt of a man who watched something happen on his property and could not look a widow in the eye afterward without carrying the full weight of what his machinery had done. He had stood at the graveside with his hat in both hands, a short man made shorter by what he carried, and he had said nothing because there was nothing to say, and Cora had respected him for understanding that silence was sometimes the only honest thing left to offer. What the mill owner could not pay for was what came after. Amos had been a good man. He had loved his wife with the quiet constancy of someone who had never once considered doing otherwise, not because he lacked imagination, but because he lacked the restlessness that makes other men look elsewhere for what they already have. He had worked the 40 acres with patience and with care, and with the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that if you stayed with a piece of land long enough, it would eventually give you what you needed. He had been right about that mostly. The land produced, the garden produced enough to fill the cellar every autumn. The hog they slaughtered each November produced enough salt pork to last until spring. What Amos had not been was lucky. There had been the year the creek flooded and took the corn in June when they could not replant in time, and the winter was leaner than it should have been. The year the blight came through and halved the potato crop, a rolling gray-black death moving through the rows from the north end of the garden, and nothing to be done but watch it come. The year a heifer died in the 3rd month of her first pregnancy, and the investment she represented in both money and expectation died with her on the frozen ground of the east pasture. None of these things were Amos's fault. None of them were the result of bad judgment or carelessness or drink. They were simply the mathematics of farming in the Ozarks in the 1880s, where the margin between adequate and desperate was measured in inches of rain and degrees of frost, in the particular random cruelty of weather that does not consult your plans before proceeding with its own. When the debts were settled and the accounts were squared and the mill owner's guilt money had covered the pine box and the grave digging, Cora Vance was left with the 40 acres, the cabin, and $14 in a tin box on the shelf above the fireplace. She stood at the top of the hill and counted what she had. The cabin was one large room of chinked logs with a stone chimney that drew well when the wind was from the south and drew poorly when it came from the north, which was most of the winter. The plank floor had begun to separate at the joints from too many years of expansion and contraction, swelling in the summer humidity and shrinking in the winter to dry, the boards finding their own gaps and maintaining them. The shingle roof leaked in two places, both of them above the sleeping area, both of them documented by water stains on the ceiling boards that had been there since before Amos bought the property. He had planned to re-shingle before his third winter. He had not gotten to it in 11 years, which was not negligence, but the particular postponement of a man with more tasks than days to complete them. The fireplace consumed wood at a rate that had seemed manageable when there were two people to split and stack it. Now there was one. The heat it produced traveled to the ceiling and out through the log walls with an efficiency that made Cora's teeth clench when she thought about it all. That labor, all that wood, and most of it escaping into the Ozark air within an hour of being generated. Nothing stored in the cabin kept properly. The temperature swung 40 degrees between the scorching zone near the fireplace and the cold zone near the walls, and food caught in that variation suffered for it. The garden was finished for the year. The hog had been slaughtered in September early because Amos had been planning to slaughter it in late October, and then he was gone and the thing still needed doing, and Cora had done it herself the way she had done most things herself over the course of a marriage to a good man who was frequently occupied elsewhere on the farm. The root cellar was already there. It was dug into the north-facing side of the low hill, dug decades before Amos had bought the land by hands that had left no record of themselves beyond the work they had done. 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hillside, 7 feet tall at its highest point, where the split oak beams supporting the earthen roof left room enough for a person of ordinary height to stand without stooping. The walls were dry stacked limestone fitted without mortar, by someone who had understood that limestone needs to breathe, that a sealed stone wall in damp ground will eventually heave and crack and fail, but a dry stacked wall will hold for generations, each stone seated against its neighbor by weight and friction and the logic of fit. The floor was packed earth-worn smooth and hard by decades of foot traffic. So many passages in and out over so many years that the dirt had compressed itself into something approaching the hardness of fired clay, uneven in the way of things shaped by use rather than intention, with a low spot near the entrance where water had once pooled and been walked over until the depression was as smooth as the rest. The door was set into a stone-framed entrance on the south side of the hill, the warm side where the winter sun could reach it, and it sloped slightly downward from the surface so that rainwater ran away from the threshold rather than into it. The door itself was oak plank, 2 inches thick, hung on iron hinges that had been fitted into the stone frame with a precision that someone had taken care over someone who had understood that a door used every day for decades needs to hang true or it will wear itself into failure. Whoever had built this cellar had built it to last. The air inside was cold and still and smelled of old stone and the ghost of something sweet, the apples the previous owner had stored there years ago before he sold the land to Amos and moved west to become someone else's history in someone else's county. The sweetness was long gone from anything real. It was a memory held in the stone the way stone holds things long after the thing itself has departed. Cora stood in the doorway of the root cellar on the morning of October the 23rd, 1884, and looked at what she was standing inside. 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, 7 feet tall. The previous occupants of this land had used it the way every farmer in the Ozarks used a root cellar, as a coal box, a storage hole, a place where the inevitable surplus of autumn could be held against the inevitable scarcity of winter. Potatoes in the corner, apples along one wall, turnips and carrots packed in sand beets in their boxed cabbages hung from the beams. You put things in. You took things out. The purpose of the space was cold storage and nothing else, and in 40 years no one who had opened this door had asked whether the purpose could be wider. Cora asked. She stood in the cold, still air with her coat buttoned to the collar and she turned around slowly, and she looked at the walls and the ceiling and the floor, and she did what she had been trained by 58 years of Ozark life to do when she stood in a space and wanted to understand it. She looked for what was already there. The rotted keg staves she noticed first, a single curved board, and two rusted iron rings in the far corner, the evidence of something that had been stored too long and forgotten too thoroughly. A barrel of something perhaps left when the previous owner departed. Below the stave, the earth had been disturbed at some point and then packed back down by the ordinary traffic of foot traffic over time. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil. The color was different here, darker than the surrounding earth with a faint char to it. Not from a fire above ground that had sent heat down through the soil. From something that had burned down here, underground in this enclosed space and had been extinguished. She found the hook 3 inches down. It was iron hand-forged heavy, the kind of hook made for hanging something that had weight to it, a ham or a side of pork or a large iron pot, something that required a hook set with intention rather than with convenience. It was embedded in the earth at an angle as if it had been part of a structure that had been removed or had collapsed and left only this buried evidence of itself. Near it was a fragment of wood 4 inches long, scorched at one end. The scorch was old, dried into the grain of the wood without the char smell that fresh burning worries. The fragment was soft with age in the cellar's perpetual moisture, but the burn mark was as legible as the day it was made. Cora sat back on her heels with the fragment in her hand. Someone had tried to put a fire in this cellar before her. Not a candle, not a lantern, a fire, something that generated enough heat to char wood and enough permanence to require a hook for hanging. They had tried it, and they had stopped, and they had packed their hook under 3 inches of earth and left the charred wood to tell whoever came next what had happened here before. The question was not whether it had been done. The question was why it had been abandoned. She thought about it for a long time, crouched in the cold underground air, with the fragment between her fingers, turning it over and feeling the texture of the burned end smooth where the heat had changed the wood's surface rough, at the break where it had separated from whatever larger piece it had once been part of. The most likely answer was smoke. A fire without a proper flue fills an enclosed space faster than you would believe possible if you had never experienced it. 2 minutes, sometimes less, and the air becomes unbreathable. Whoever had tried this before, and she would never know who or when or whether they had been a man or a woman, young or old, hopeful or desperate, had not solved the smoke problem. They had built their fire and the smoke had filled the space, and they had choked and climbed out and never came back to try again. Cora looked up at the ceiling. The split oak beams ran across the width of the cellar at regular intervals, darkened with age and the accumulated moisture of years. Between two of them near the back wall where the ceiling was tallest, there was a dark vertical line in the limestone, a shadow that ran from the level of the beams upward into the earth and rock above. She climbed onto the wooden shelf bracket along the back wall, 1 foot on the lower bracket and one on the upper, and pressed her palm flat against the limestone beside the shadow. Cold air. Moving cold air, barely perceptible against her skin, but unmistakably there, a draw upward through the limestone, as if the stone were breathing. A natural fissure. A crack that ran from inside the cellar up through 2 feet of packed earth and clay and limestone, and out somewhere to the open air above the hill. She could not see its terminus from below. She would have to look for it from above. But she could feel it, and what she could feel was movement, the constant, gentle pressure of outside cold, pulling interior warmth upward through the available path, the way any temperature differential finds any available passage and exploits it. Not large, not obvious, easy to miss if you were looking for nothing in particular, or if you were looking for the wrong thing. She pressed her palm harder and felt the draw against her skin. It was not a chimney, but it was what a chimney needed to be, a path from the heat below to the cold above, with enough differential between them to create sustained movement in the air. A flue, an accidental one given by the geology of the hillside without any intention, but a flue nonetheless. Whoever had tried before had built their fire in the wrong place, or without any means of directing the smoke upward, or both. They had made smoke and been defeated by it and given up. Cora stood on the shelf bracket in the cold underground air, with her palm against the moving stone, and understood what they had missed, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement exactly, because excitement belongs to the young. And she had been 58 years old long enough to know the difference between the feeling of a good idea and the feeling of an idea that might actually work. What she felt was something older and quieter than excitement. The specific satisfaction of a question that has been asked and is beginning to find its answer. She climbed down from the bracket and stood in the cellar for a while longer, measuring with her eye and with the knowledge she had accumulated over 58 years of living in houses and on land, of building and repairing and understanding the way heat and cold behave in enclosed spaces. The back third of the cellar, 8 feet nearest the back wall where the ceiling was highest and the fissure was located, was where a stove would have to go. The front 2/3, the 12 feet nearest the door, would remain cold. The thermal mass of the limestone and the 2 feet of packed earth above it would separate the zones. The fissure would handle the smoke. She walked back to the cabin in the thin October light and looked at the cast iron stove standing against the north wall where it had stood for 11 years. 200 pounds, she estimated, perhaps 240. She had moved it once before 6 years ago when the floor beneath it had rotted through, and Amos had lifted one end while she had lifted the other, and they had walked it sideways 3 feet to clear the damaged boards. That time, there had been two of them. She spent the rest of the day planning. She began on the 1st of November. The stove came apart the way a thing built to last comes apart when you approach it with patience and the right tools, reluctantly but completely. She removed the warming shelf, first cast iron, perhaps 20 pounds, carried on her hip, with the particular awkwardness of moving something heavy that has no comfortable grip. Then the stovepipe sections, one by one, each piece wrapped in cloth torn from a worn-out shirt to keep the joints from separating in transit. Then the ash pan. Then the oven door on its hinges, the firebox door, the damper plate. Then the legs, each one bolted to the body with square head bolts she had to search through Amos's toolbox to find the proper wrench for. And then finally the body of the stove itself. She rigged a cradle from 2 fence rails she had taken from the east pasture fence, where a section had already failed and the wood was drying in the grass. She tied them together at intervals with rope, creating a flat platform with handles at each end, and she tilted the stove body onto it with the careful, controlled force of someone who cannot afford to let the thing fall. She had packed the slope from the cabin to the cellar door with planks laid flat, barnboard, scrap, lumber, anything flat enough to slide on, creating a track down the hill. She moved the stove the way a woman moves anything that is heavier than she can lift, by making the ground do the work. 3 feet, then reset the planks below the cradle and pull the planks from behind it forward. 3 more feet. The oak plank door to the cellar was wide enough by 4 inches, which felt like very little with a 200-pound object in a rope cradle, but was enough. She got it inside by midday of the second day. Her lower back communicated its position on the matter clearly by evening of the second day, and more clearly still by morning of the third. She assembled the stove against the back wall of the cellar directly beneath the fissure in the limestone. She had cut the stovepipe sections to length and angle before bringing them down, calculating the run needed to reach the crack in the ceiling from the stove's collar. A slight angle from vertical that she had measured with a plumb line dropped from the fissure and a straight edge held from the stove position. The fit was close. She sealed around the pipe at the ceiling joint with clay she had mixed herself. Clay dug from the creek bank, worked to consistency with water, and her hands packed into every gap between the iron pipe and the limestone with her fingers, until the seal was complete and there was no path for smoke except upward. Then she packed flat stones around the base of the pipe seal, pressing them into the clay, while it was still workable, creating a collar of stone around the joint that would hold the clay in compression rather than letting it shrink away from the iron as it dried. This was the kind of detail that the person who had tried before her might not have known to do or might not have had the patience for. Cora had the patience. She laid the platform last. Flat limestone slabs from the creek bed, each one lugged up the slope and down into the cellar individually, the work of a full afternoon, 20 pounds each, 30, for the larger ones set into a single layer over the packed earth floor directly beneath the stove. The platform raised the stove 4 inches off the earth. Thermal mass stone that would absorb the stove's radiant heat during cooking and give it back slowly into the cellar floor for hours after the fire died. She had not read this in a book. There were no books about it. She had worked it out from first principles, from the same knowledge that had told her 15 years earlier, when she and Amos had built the brick hearth in the cabin's summer kitchen, that a cooking surface laid over a bed of sand and brick retained heat differently than one laid over earth or wood. That mass below a heat source extended the useful life of the heat source after the fire was gone. The physics did not require a name. It required only observation and the willingness to apply what observation had shown. On the evening of November the 3rd, 1884, she built a small fire in the stove. A handful of kindling, a small split of oak over it when the kindling caught. She stood back against the cold zone wall with her arms folded and watched the stovepipe. The smoke went up, not sideways, not back into the cellar in the choking wave that had defeated whoever had tried before her. It rose through the firebox and up the pipe and vanished through the limestone fissure with a draw that was stronger than she had anticipated, stronger in fact than most of the cabin chimneys she had cooked beside for 58 years. The temperature differential between the warm cellar air and the cold November night above was greater than the differential in a cabin chimney, where the fire itself was contributing warmth to the space and reducing the gap between inside and outside. Here the cellar was cold. The outside was cold, but the pipe was warm from the fire, and the draw it created was sharp and clean. The cellar filled with the smell of wood smoke for perhaps 40 seconds. Then it cleared. The draft was pulling the smoke straight up before it could disperse. She stood in the warming air and breathed it clean air cold at her back, where the stone wall stayed cool and warm at her front, where the stove was beginning to give off its heat, and she listened to the cast iron tick and expand as it came up to temperature. And she understood with the particular clarity that comes after a long period of careful thinking that the system was going to work. Not approximately, not with qualifications and workarounds, and the constant management that failed solutions always require. It was going to work the way a thing works when it is built in alignment with the principles that govern it, the same principles that govern the behavior of heat and cold, and air and stone and earth, regardless of whether anyone has ever named them or acknowledged them or understood that they were operating. She added more wood. Within 20 minutes, the back 8 feet of the cellar, the cooking zone, the warm end, was 68 degrees. She stood in it in her coat and felt the warmth on her face and the backs of her hands. 8 feet forward past the point where the stove's heat surrendered to the thermal mass of the limestone walls, and the earth above the temperature was 47 degrees. She could see the boundary where the two zones negotiated with each other, a slight shimmer in the lamplight, the almost visible place where warm and cool met and held their border. She stayed in the cellar until the fire died down to coals, and the cooking zone had begun its slow descent back toward the cold zone temperature. She did not return to the cabin. She sat on the shelf bracket beside the stove, with her coat across her lap, and ate a cold supper cornbread, from the morning a slice of cold salt pork, and watched the limestone walls in the lamplight, and thought about what she had built. She had a cold room that would not freeze. The earth would see to that. She had a warm room where she could cook. The stove would see to that. She had the oldest refrigerator in the world, the earth itself, at a depth where the chaos of the surface never reached, and she had added heat to it without destroying the cold, because the heat was contained at the back end while the cold was maintained at the front, and the limestone walls between them absorbed the warmth before it could travel. 2 rooms in one, she thought. The earth makes the cold room. I just make the warm one. The news reached Harlan Briggs by the second week of November. Harlan Briggs ran the general store in Calder's Crossing, 9 miles east of the Vance property, and had run it for 19 years. He was 63 years old, a compact and deliberate man with a white beard he kept trimmed close and eyes the color of creek water in the dry weeks of August, a pale greenish gray that suggested clarity but offered nothing reflective behind it. He was not a cruel man. He was not, by the standards of his county or his era, an unusual man. He had opinions about most things within his field of vision and the settled confidence of someone who had been the person most often consulted for long enough that being consulted had become indistinguishable from being right. He had known Amos Vance in the way of commerce, a man who paid his accounts without requiring reminders, who did not complain about prices, who did not volunteer opinions in the store. These were the qualities Harlan valued in a customer, and he had valued Amos accordingly. The widow he knew less. Cora Vance had come into the store perhaps 5 times in the 11 years she and Amos had lived on the 40 acres, and each time she had known exactly what she needed and said so directly, and paid without negotiation, and left without the conversational pleasantries that most customers exchange as a form of social rent. He had found her efficient in a way that he associated with women who had no patience for performance, which he admired in the abstract and found slightly unsettling in practice. When the Pruitt boy, 17 years old, sent to Calder's Crossing for a 20-pound sack of salt, mentioned in passing that the Vance widow had moved her cook stove into the root cellar and appeared to be cooking underground, Harlan stopped wiping the counter and looked up. "The root cellar," he said. "Yes, sir. My daddy seen the stovepipe coming out the hillside. She run it up through the rock somehow." Harlan set down his cloth. "She'll poison herself," he said. It was not a considered opinion. It was the response of a man who had sold smokehouses and spring houses and root vegetables for 19 years and knew or believed he knew the proper order of things. You cannot cook in a hole. The smoke fills the space inside of 2 minutes. And the heat from a cook stove will rot everything she's got stored down there inside of a week. He said it with the weight of someone for whom the matter was already settled. 3 other men were in the store that morning, Aldrich and 2 of the Mossberg brothers. They heard it. By evening, the statement had traveled to 4 dinner tables, and by the following week, it had become, in the way of small county certainties, the settled opinion of Calder's Crossing that the widow Vance had gone a little strange since her husband's death, that grief does particular things to people, and that the woman up on the hill would be eating spoiled vegetables and coughing soot before the end of February. Cora heard about it. In the Ozarks in 1884, you heard everything eventually. The county was not large, and the winters closed people inward toward their neighbors in ways that the open seasons did not require, and news moved through the community with the particular velocity it acquires when it carries judgment alongside information. She heard it from Nora Pruitt, who told her with the apologetic discomfort of someone delivering news she had not asked to be the carrier of, and who seemed relieved when Cora received it without visible reaction. "He said what he said," Cora told her. "I thought you should know is all." "I do know," Cora said. "Thank you for telling me." She walked home along the creek path in the last hour of afternoon light, with the bare hickory branches making their skeletal patterns against the pale sky, and she thought about what it meant to be wrong in public and what it meant to be right in private, and she thought about the charred fragments she had found in the cellar floor and the person who had tried before her and failed, and she thought about the stovepipe ascending clean and straight through the limestone fissure, drawing smoke up and out into the cold air above the hill. She was not angry. She had been 58 years old, long enough to understand that anger at the judgments of men like Harlan Briggs was a drain on a resource she needed elsewhere. What she felt instead was something she did not have a precise name for, a kind of settling, like the limestone walls of the cellar itself. Stone seating against stone without mortar, holding by weight and fit, in the accumulated logic of how things are correctly arranged. She went home and built a fire in the underground stove and put a pot of bean soup on and let the cellar warm around her, and ate supper in the underground kitchen, while outside the temperature fell to 26 degrees and ice formed in the shallow margins of the creek. The soup was good. The cellar held 49 degrees in the cold zone. The stovepipe drew without complaint. She washed her bowl and banked the fire and climbed the dark slope back to the cabin to sleep. December came hard. The first serious cold front of 1884 swept down from the northern plains in the second week of December and sat over the Ozarks for 9 consecutive days. The temperature at the cabin fell to 12 degrees at night. The water in the bucket by the door froze solid before morning. Cora sealed the gap between the logs on the north wall with strips of burlap soaked in lard. Her mother's remedy, reliable but impermanent, requiring renewal after every hard rain. But the cabin's interior temperature still swung 40 degrees between the fireplace zone and the wall zone, and nothing she stored inside it kept properly. In the root cellar, the temperature held at 48 degrees, not 40, not 55. 48, a number that was not an accident or an approximation, but a consequence of physics as reliable as arithmetic. The Earth is an enormous thermal mass. The heat stored in the rock and soil of the Ozark Hills from the previous summer's sun does not release itself in a week or a month. It releases over the entire winter, slowly and continuously, maintaining the subsurface temperature at a point that reflects the year's average rather than any single day's extreme. At 8 feet below the surface, the Ozark earth held close to 50 degrees year-round, and the packed earth and limestone of the cellar's walls and ceiling insulated the interior from the chaos that the surface was experiencing above. The chaos above during that December was significant and sustained. Cora had organized the cold zone with the thoroughness she brought to most things, not the thoroughness of someone who has read about organization, but the thoroughness of someone who has spent 58 years learning from consequence, who has watched food spoil because it was stored wrong and has stored it correctly since. The crocks of sauerkraut sat on the middle shelf of the east wall, 12 cores, the cabbage packed tight and covered with brine and weighted down with flat stones, the crocks covered with cloth to keep out any debris that might fall from the ceiling. At 48 degrees, the fermentation was slow and controlled and steady, the bacteria working at the pace the temperature dictated rather than the irregular and sometimes excessive pace of a warmer environment. She checked them every 3 days, pressing the cabbage below the brine line with clean hands, finding nothing to skim, because nothing was growing that should not have been growing, the fermentation proceeding exactly as slow and consistent fermentation proceeds toward a clean, sharp, reliable product. The butter was in the northwest corner at 45 degrees, the coldest point in the cellar, nearest the door, furthest from the stove. 6 pounds of October butter packed in wet cloth and set on the lowest shelf. In the cabin, butter had been alternating between stone-hard and soft runny, depending on its position relative to the fireplace, and the cycling between states was breaking down its structure. In the cellar, it was firm and cold and tasted the way October butter tastes, when October has not yet left it like the last good grass before the freeze clean and slightly sweet. Eggs in straw-lined baskets, 3 dozen each. One laid point down, which slows moisture loss through the shell. At 47 degrees in still air, eggs kept for 3 weeks without meaningful quality loss. In the cabin through the cold of December, she had been losing 1 in 10 to freezing. The smoked pork hung from the hook she had found in the earth, cleaned with a wire brush, and set into a crack in the limestone wall at ceiling height, in the coldest corner exactly as the hook had apparently been intended to be used by whoever had put it there and been defeated by smoke before they could make use of it. The September pork hung at 45 degrees in the cool, dry air, drying slowly toward the dense exterior that meant preservation completed correctly, the skin beginning to develop, the characteristic hardness, the fat firm and white, the smell clean and distinctly hickory, with nothing beneath it that should not have been there. On the floor, potatoes in straw-lined boxes, each tuber separated from its neighbors by straw, so that a single bad one could not transfer its failure to those around it. Turnips in sand, carrots buried in damp sawdust that she refreshed each week, pulling out the old and packing in fresh. Beets in their own box along the north wall. Cabbages hung upside down from the ceiling, joists with their roots wrapped in damp burlap, their outer leaves still green in December, because the cool, humid air of the cellar was not drying them out the way an above-ground storage space would have done. Onions and garlic braided on strings beside the cabbages, drying slowly in the gentle air. Circulation created by the temperature differential between the cooking zone and the cold zone, a natural convection current barely perceptible to the skin that moved air through the cellar without the drying drafts that shriveled food too quickly or the stagnation that invited mold. The whole system ran on nothing but firewood and understanding. Christmas of 1884, Cora Vance ate a dinner that no one witnessed and no one knew about. She cooked it in the underground kitchen in the warmth of the cast-iron stove, the stovepipe drawing steadily above her, and the cooking zone at 68 degrees, and the smell of the food she was making drifting upward through the pipe and out into the cold December air above the hill, where it met the night air and dispersed into nothing. She had a slice of the hung pork, pink and firm, and smelling of hickory and nothing else. She had potatoes boiled and finished in the pork drippings with dried herbs from the string that hung near the stove, thyme and sage that had dried here in the cellar's air rather than in the sun above, retaining more of their oil than sun-dried herbs. She had sauerkraut from the crock, clean and sharp and exactly right. She had bread she had baked 3 days earlier, the dough risen on the warm counter beside the stove while she did other work, the baking filling the underground space with the smell of yeast and crust that disappeared up the stovepipe before it could reach anyone who might have followed it to its source. She ate alone at the wooden counter beside the stove, her back to the warm wall, and her face to the cold zone where the crocks and baskets and boxes and hung meats stood in the lamplight, keeping their patient vigil at 47 degrees. Amos had been a good man. She missed him in the way you miss someone who has been present every day for decades, not as a dramatic absence, but as a continuous small one present in every ordinary moment. The single mug on the shelf, the silence after supper that had never been silence when he was there, because he had been a man who talked when he had something to say and said it without preamble. The particular weight of being the only person on 40 acres who knew what was in the cellar and what the spring would need and what was left to do before February. She had always known these things. Now she was the only one who did. She ate her Christmas dinner and washed the single plate and set it on the shelf and banked the fire and climbed the dark slope to the cabin. She had enough food to last until April. Harlan Briggs had told half the county she would be sick or sorry by February. She was not angry. She was not even particularly satisfied in the way that satisfaction requires an audience. She was simply a woman who had looked at what she had and built what the situation required, and the situation was proceeding as a situation proceeds when the thinking behind it was sound. The cold would keep, the earth would hold. And the winter that the people of the Ozark Hills feared and planned for, and sometimes in spite of their planning, still failed to survive, that winter was going to be for Cordelia Vance in the year 1884, a problem that had already been solved. 12 miles east in the back room of the general store in Calder's Crossing, Harlan Briggs was cataloging a new shipment of dry goods and periodically telling anyone who would listen that the widow Vance would be sick or sorry or both before the snow melted. He said it with the tone of a man who has made a prediction and is waiting for the satisfaction of seeing it confirmed, not yet understanding that the wait was going to be longer than he had planned, and that what arrived at the end of it would not be confirmation. He was wrong about all of it. He just didn't know it yet. And somewhere in the limestone under a low hill in the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri, a cast iron stove ticked softly as it cooled, radiating its stored heat into the flat stone platform below it, and the cold zone beyond the warmth held its 47 degrees with the indifference of something that has been holding that temperature since long before anyone was alive to measure it. January arrived in the Ozark Hills the way January always arrived, without apology and without ceremony, pressing down on the land with a weight that was not merely cold but absolute, the kind of cold that strips the world back to its essential components and holds them there until spring decides to relent. Stone, wood, fire, the breath you can see leaving your body and watch dissolve into the air, the sound of your own boots on frozen ground, the distance between where you are and where you need to be, measured not in miles but in the effort each mile will require. Cora Vance had learned to read January the way her father had taught her to read a river, not by the surface which showed you what the water was doing today, but by the depths which showed you what it was going to do next week. You learned to look past the obvious and into the structure of the thing. You learned that what was visible was rarely the most important part. What was happening beneath the surface in the limestone and packed earth of the root cellar, beneath the low hill on the 40 acres, was nothing at all. That was the point. The earth beneath the frost line did not register January. It did not respond to the cold front that had been sitting over the county since mid-December. It held its 47 degrees the way it held all its temperatures, with the complete indifference of something that answers to geological time rather than seasonal time, measuring its changes in centuries rather than months. And in that indifference was a stability that no above-ground structure in the county was capable of matching. Cora cooked 2 meals a day every day without variation. Breakfast at 7, whatever the morning required. Cornmeal mush with butter and a slice of the hung pork most mornings. Biscuits made with lard and baking soda on the mornings when she had the patience and the inclination, which was most of them, because the process of making biscuits in the warm end of the cellar with the stove going and the smell of baking filling the underground space was one of the more pleasant ways she knew to spend 45 minutes of a January morning. Coffee black in the single tin mug on the shelf beside the stove. The fire burned for 90 minutes at breakfast, long enough to bring the cooking zone to 65 degrees, warm enough to work in, without a coat warm enough to rise a small batch of dough, or on the wooden counter beside the stove. Supper at 4 before the light failed and the slope back to the cabin became treacherous in the dark. This was the longer fire, 2 hours, sometimes more, when she was making something that needed time. Bean soup with the salt pork and dried herbs. Potato soup with the last of the autumn cream she had skimmed from the milk and held in a covered pail. Braised turnips in the pork fat left from the morning. On Sundays, she baked bread, the dough rising during the morning fire, and the baking happening during the afternoon one, and the smell of it rose through the stovepipe and drifted out over the frozen hillside and disappeared into the cold air above the bare trees, noticed only by the crows who had no opinions about widows. After each fire died, the cellar cooled. This was the rhythm she had built, and the rhythm worked with a precision she had not fully anticipated when she designed it. The cooking zone, which reached 65 to 70 degrees during a full meal's preparation, returned to 52 degrees within 90 minutes of the fire going out. The cold zone never rose above 51 during cooking and sat at a steady 47 degrees at all other times. The thermal mass of the limestone walls and the 2 feet of packed earth above the weight of the hill itself absorbed the cooking heat before it could travel more than a few feet toward the cold zone and released it slowly enough that the cold zone's temperature barely registered the change. It was like having 2 separate rooms connected by a hallway, except the hallway was made of stone and earth and did the work of insulation without being asked to. 2 rooms in one space. The division between them invisible but absolute. It was the milk that showed her what else the system was doing. She had brought 3 pails of milk down to the cellar in the first week of January. The cow was still producing through the winter lean production, but reliable, and the milk needed to be kept somewhere cooler than the cabin, where it turned in a day, and warmer than the outdoors, where it froze solid and separated by midnight. She covered the pails with cloth and set them on the second shelf of the cold zone and went back to other work. On the 4th day, she lifted the cloth from the first pail and found the milk fresh. Not merely unfrozen, not just uncongealed in the way of cold milk. Fresh, sweet smelling, the way milk smells when it has just come from an animal and not yet begun the long, slow chemistry of its own deterioration. She put a finger in and tasted it and stood in the cold zone with the taste of fresh milk in her mouth and the particular stillness of someone who has just noticed something that doesn't fit the map they've been working from. In the cabin, milk lasted a day, 2 occasionally if the cabin temperature dropped low enough overnight, but then it thickened wrong when it warmed and the flavor had changed. In a spring house, the traditional solution that most Ozark farms maintained over a cold-running creek milk lasted 2 days at the water temperature, 3 in a hard winter when the water ran especially cold. The spring house was the gold standard of farm cold storage in the county, and it gave you 3 days. This milk had lasted 4 days and was still sweet. She set the pail down and thought carefully about why. The temperature was correct 47 degrees, consistent with what a spring house managed on a good day. But spring houses were damp by definition, wet from the creek. They were built over their stone walls, perpetually sweating with condensation, and that moisture created conditions that accelerated bacterial growth even at low temperatures. The cellar should have had the same problem. Underground stone in winter surrounded by earth that held moisture, it should have been at least as damp as a spring house. She pressed her palm against the cold zone wall. The stone was cool and dry. She pressed her palm against the wall in the cooking zone beside the stove, slightly damp as you'd expect near a heat source that was pulling moisture from the air around it. She looked up at the stovepipe. The fire pulled air upward. Warm air carries moisture with it. This she knew from years of watching the inside of windows fog when the fireplace was burning, from knowing that the steam that rose from a pot was not just steam, but the air above the pot, too, carrying water away from the surface. The convection current she had built, warm air rising through the pipe twice a day, cool, dry air, settling in behind it, was pulling the humid underground air upward and out with every cooking cycle, and the cool outside air that settled back in to replace it was dry winter air, and the twice-daily exchange was maintaining the cold zone's humidity at a level that she had no right to expect from an underground space. She had not designed this. She had not known it was happening. She had built a kitchen and accidentally built a ventilation system, and the ventilation system was managing the cellar's humidity the way a properly designed smokehouse manages its internal atmosphere, not by eliminating the moisture, but by cycling it through at intervals short enough that it never accumulated to the levels that encouraged spoilage. The milk lasted 4 days. The sauerkraut fermented without a trace of mold. The butter held its flavor into the 3rd week of January, not hardening, not going rancid, simply remaining what it had been when she packed it. October butter, clean and slightly sweet. The hung pork in the coldest corner at 45 degrees was proceeding toward the dense, dark, preserved exterior. That meant the curing process was complete and correct. Not the case-hardened failure of pork that had been smoked too hot and then stored too cold, the external layer so hard and impermeable that the interior could not breathe and eventually compromised itself. The genuine article, firm and dark at the rind, pale and firm in the fat deep, rose in the lean, smelling of hickory smoke and thyme and nothing that should not have been there. Cora stood in the cold zone of her underground kitchen in the second week of January 1885 and understood that she had built something considerably better than she had planned when she stood in the doorway in October and began to ask what the space could be. She went back to work. February came and went, and the potatoes in the straw-lined boxes did not sprout. This was more significant than it might seem to someone who had not watched potatoes fail in storage. Potatoes are profoundly sensitive to temperature, a few degrees above their preferred range, and they conclude that spring has arrived and begin the effort of growing pale, soft shoots that drain the stored energy from the tuber as they reach for a light they will never find in a closed cellar, leaving behind them a softened, increasingly hollow potato that feeds nobody well. A few degrees below, and the water in their cells begins to freeze and expand, rupturing the cellular structure, turning firm flesh to mush that thaws into an unpleasant gray softness with a chemical sweetness that announces irreversible damage. The window between these two failure modes is narrow and in above-ground storage. In a Missouri winter, the swings of temperature that moved through that window warm spell to cold snap to warm again were constant and unavoidable. At 47 degrees consistent and unvarying, the potatoes were dormant, still and patient and firm, holding everything the summer had given them, waiting. In March, when Gideon Pruitt rode over to check on her, he was a careful man who had known Amos and felt a responsibility toward the 40 acres and its single occupant that he had not put words to but acted on. He found her at the top of the hill on a flat rock in the thin early spring sun with a bowl of potato soup balanced on her knee. He looked at the soup. "Those are good potatoes," he said. He knew what he was saying. He had been eating his own stored potatoes since January and February. Potatoes from an above-ground cellar have a specific character, soft at the edge, gray in the flesh, the flavor gone from starch to something vaguely chemical, the way a potato tastes when it has been through too many freeze-thaw cycles and given too much of itself to the effort of not dying. "They are," Cora said. He looked at the hillside for a moment, the stovepipe standing inert in the afternoon, the trickle of smoke from the morning's fire long since gone. He did not say anything else, but he thought about it on the ride home, and he thought about it for the rest of the week, and thinking about it changed something in the way he thought about what was possible on a piece of Ozark land with the right kind of attention. Spring broke in April with the particular urgency of Ozark Springs, the hills going green faster than you expected, the creek running red with clay for 2 weeks, and then clearing to the limestone green that filtered the light into the hillsides in a way that made everything look slightly luminous. The redbud came out early. The wild plum was a week behind it. Cora took stock. The potatoes had lasted to the third week of April, firm, edible, worth eating rather than merely acceptable. 4 months and 3 weeks in storage without sprouting, without softening, without the accumulated compromises that made late winter potatoes an endurance rather than a meal. She had not culled a single box. She had not eaten a questionable one first to stay ahead of the spoilage. She had eaten good potatoes through the entire winter because she had kept them at the temperature they needed to be kept at, which was a thing that turned out to be more achievable than most of the county believed, given the right understanding of what the ground beneath their feet was already doing. The sauerkraut, clean and sharp through the last quart, consistent in flavor from the first crock opened in December to the last opened in March. None of the variation that characterized above-ground fermentation, where temperature swings produced uneven bacterial activity, and the flavor ranged from acceptable to too sour to vaguely off, depending on what the weather had been doing that week. The butter gone, she had eaten it all, but the last of it consumed in the third week of March had tasted like the butter from October, and not like the butter of March, which in an above-ground storage situation would have begun the slow turn toward the rancid that warm spells and cold snaps together produce in fat. The hung pork still hanging, pink at the center, firm, and dark at the exterior, smelling of hickory smoke and nothing else. She would not finish it until June, 9 months after slaughter, and it would be good then too. She planted her garden and did not think about Harlan Briggs. She thought about next winter. The autumn of 1885 came early and came with the particular cruelty of early autumns, which give you no time to adjust your expectations before delivering the consequence. The first frost arrived on September the 28th, 3 weeks before its usual date, sliding down from the north on a night that had been mild at sunset and was 29 degrees by 3 in the morning. Gardens caught mid-harvest across the county. Tomatoes blackened on the vine. Bean plants collapsed. A neighbor 2 miles east lost his entire sweet potato crop. He had planned to dig it the following week, and the week came and went, and there was nothing left worth digging. Cora had been watching the sky since the second week of September, reading the signs she had learned from her father and from 40-odd years of her own observation, the way the geese moved earlier than usual with the particular urgency of animals operating on information that humans were not privy to, the thickness of the oak bark on the north side of the trees, the volume of the creek in late summer that told her how much cold the northern highlands had stored in their snowpack going into the previous winter. She had dug her sweet potatoes on the 21st. She had pulled her beans on the 24th. The tomatoes she had been putting up since September 1st, and by the 27th, she had worked through everything the garden still had to give. When the frost came on, the 28th, she lost the pumpkins too large to move quickly, and she had miscalculated by 2 days and the last of the late-season squash. Everything else was already in the cellar or on the shelves. She stood in the frost-killed garden the morning of the 29th and looked at what had been lost and calculated what remained and found the balance acceptable. Not comfortable, not abundant. Acceptable, the kind of adequate that means you will not be desperate in February, which is what mattered. In Calder's Crossing, Harlan Briggs had not revisited his prediction about Cora Vance, because revisiting it would have required acknowledging that it had not been correct, and Harlan was not a man who acknowledged things that required him to revise his standing in his own estimation. He had not changed his view. He had simply stopped expressing it in situations where it might encounter contradiction, which is the behavior of a man who has stopped believing what he says without being willing to stop saying it. He continued to advise the county on matters of food storage, which was his right as the man who sold the materials for food storage and had done so for 19 years. He told the Aldrich family, whose spring house roof had been damaged by the early frost, to rebuild it wider and deeper. He told the Mossberg brothers, whose smokehouse ran too warm in the shoulder seasons, that a larger and hotter initial fire would solve their temperature inconsistency. He told anyone who inquired about the widow and the underground stovepipe that they were asking about a situation that had been exaggerated in the telling. Willa Briggs heard him say all of this and did not correct him. She was 61 years old and had spent 32 years watching her husband be certain about things, and she had developed over those 32 years the kind of precision instrument that long observation of a single person's habits of mind will produce if you are paying attention. She could tell the difference between Harlan's certainty that came from knowledge and his certainty that came from never having been wrong in front of people who were looking to him to be right. They felt different from the inside of a room with him. They looked different from the outside of his face. What she had heard about Cora Vance's cellar sounded to this instrument like knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from actually doing a thing and observing what happens, rather than from deciding in advance what should happen. What Harlan was saying about it sounded like the other kind. In February of 1886, on a day when the temperature in Calder's Crossing fell to 16 degrees, and the road between the town and the Vance property was a sheet of packed ice from the overnight freeze, Willa told Harlan she was going to the Pruitt place to check on the youngest Pruitt child who had been ill. Harlan nodded without looking up from his accounts. She was gone for 3 hours. She did not go to the Pruitt place. The path down the hillside to the cellar door had ice packed at the edges where the shade kept it from melting, and powdery snow in the middle where no one had walked recently. Willa picked her way down carefully, one hand flat against the cold hillside for balance, and stopped at the stone-framed entrance and knocked. "It's Willa Briggs," she said. "I won't stay if you'd rather I didn't." A pause, then the oak plank door opened inward and warmth came out of the opening. Not the modest warmth of a well-sealed cabin, the slight reduction of cold that good chinking and a good fire can produce in an above-ground structure. This was the warmth of an enclosed space that had been heated and had held the heat in the specific way that mass holds heat, giving it back slowly and steadily. Cora Vance stood in the doorway with a dishcloth in her hands and looked at Willa without surprise. "Come in," Cora said. Willa ducked through the low entrance and straightened up inside and stood still for a moment, adjusting her eyes to the lamplight and letting the space tell her what it was. The shelves came first, running floor to ceiling on both side walls of the cold zone, organized with a precision that Willa did not associate with either a root cellar, which she knew, or a kitchen, which she also knew, but with something in between those two categories. Some third category she didn't have a name for, where preservation and preparation occupied the same space without conflict. Crocks sealed with wax, pails covered with cloth, baskets packed with straw, strings of dried apple and braided onions and garlic hanging from the ceiling joists. The hung pork in the far corner, dark and firm, at the rind its cheesecloth wrapping still clean. Then the smell. Cold stone and wood smoke, and the faint, sweet, sour character of the fermenting crocks. And beneath all of it, something she identified after a moment as the absence of a smell, rather than its presence, the absence of the wet, slightly musty, slightly oxidized smell of food in the long middle of winter. The smell of things that have been stored correctly but are beginning to lose the argument with time. There was none of that here. The smell was clean in the way of things that have not yet begun to fail. Then the stove. Against the back wall, radiating from the joints where the iron had expanded with the fire and not yet contracted, the warming shelf above it, holding a covered pot. The cooking zone around it was warm enough that Willa could feel it on her face from across the cellar. "Sit," Cora said. Willa sat on the wooden bench along the wall, and Cora moved into the cold zone without ceremony, the way someone moves in a space they know so completely that they have stopped thinking about it, and returned holding a glass jar. The jar contained beans, not the gray, soft, cloudy beans that Willa had been pulling from her own pantry shelves since before Christmas, not the beans that had been technically preserved but had lost the argument with time, in the ways that above-ground storage loses it through temperature fluctuation and accumulated humidity and the slow chemistry of cellular degradation. These beans were green, the specific green of beans in July, the color of a full garden in late summer, when the pods are swollen and the plants are heavy with them, and you are putting up jars as fast as you can work, and this color was preserved in brine and sealed under wax and held in the dark at 47 degrees since September, and it had not changed. Willa looked at the jar for a long time. Her own pickled beans had gone soft and cloudy by Christmas. She had told herself it was the cold snap in November that had briefly dropped her pantry to near freezing temperatures. The shock of the temperature change she had thought had compromised the seal or altered the chemistry of the brine. She had eaten them anyway. They were edible. They were not this. "Can I see the stove?" she asked. Cora lit a fire with the efficiency of someone who lights fires twice a day and does not think about the process anymore. She had kindling pre-split and stored in a small wooden box beside the stove, and she built the fire in a particular way, small splits in a specific arrangement that she had worked out over the first month of use and had been doing the same way since, and within 10 minutes the cooking zone was warm enough that Willa had loosened her coat, while the cold zone 8 feet away was cold enough that she could still see her breath when she turned toward it. 2 rooms in one. "How does it not fill with smoke?" Willa asked. Cora showed her the pipe, the fissure, the clay sealed, the stack effect. She explained the draw the way she would explain anything practical, directly, without preamble, without the softening qualifications that people sometimes add when they are not certain of what they are saying. She was certain of this. She had been working with it every day for 3 months. Willa listened in the way of someone who is not collecting information for some later use, but processing it now, fitting each piece into the place it belongs in, the understanding she was building. She was an intelligent woman who had spent 3 decades in the presence of a man who believed intelligence was best expressed as certainty, and she had learned to hold her own intelligence quietly, which was not the same as not having it. 2 rooms in one, she said when Cora had finished. The earth makes the cold room. I just make the warm one, Cora said. They sat with that for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside 16 degrees in the silence of a winter afternoon when the cold has reached the depth where even the crows find somewhere else to be. Harlan doesn't know I'm here, Willa said. I know, Cora said. He'll come around eventually. Cora looked at her directly. Men like Harlan don't come around, she said. They just find a new direction to face. It was not cruel, it was accurate, the kind of statement about human nature that is accurate when it comes from someone who has been observing long enough and has no personal stake in flattering the observation. Willa looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "Those beans," she said. "The green ones. I'd like to know how you put them up." The winter of 1885 to 86 had one more thing to teach the county before it let go: the Pruitt family. Gideon and his wife Nora and their 3 children, the youngest still 4 years old, were Cora's nearest neighbors to the northeast, a mile and a half up the creek path. They were not poor in the way that poverty announces itself from the outside, with its particular slouch and its visible signs. They were poor in the way of most Ozark farming families. In the 1880s, their resources and their needs matched each other exactly when the year went well, and when the year did not go well, the match failed, and the gap between what they had and what they needed became real and immediate, and required solutions that were not always available. The year 1885 had not gone well for Gideon Pruitt. The early frost had cost him most of his sweet potato crop. He had not been watching the geese the way Cora had been watching the geese, and the timing caught him with his digging only half done. A month later, a heifer he had been counting on for winter milk went dry unexpectedly, and the calf she was carrying came 3 weeks early and did not survive the night. In December, during a 2-day ice storm that coated every surface in the Ozark Hills, in a quarter-inch of freezing rain and snapping branches from the largest oaks, with sounds like rifle shots in the cold air, one of those branches came down on the corner of the Pruitt smokehouse roof. The roof came down with it. The pork they had hung in October was exposed to 2 days of freezing rain before Gideon could cover it, and what he covered was already compromised. The jars stored on the smokehouse shelves, 12 quarts of various preserved goods, nearly a third of their winter supply, had frozen solid and then thawed, and many had cracked in the temperature change, and what came out of the cracked jars was not usable. Gideon rode to Calder's Crossing. Harlan Briggs expressed sympathy and offered credit, and told Gideon that these things happened and that a man rebuilt what the weather took down. He told him the store had salt pork at 12 cents a pound if Gideon needed to supplement his supply. Gideon Pruitt could not afford 12 cents a pound. He rode home with the credit arranged and without the answer he had needed. And he and Nora had the conversation that families have when the margin has gone from thin to absent, the conversation that does not require many words because both people already know the arithmetic, and saying it aloud does not change it. Cora heard about the smokehouse from the Mossberg boy passing on his way south 2 days after the storm. She asked one question: were the Pruitts short of food? The boy thought probably yes. She went into the cellar and stood in the cold zone for a long time and did the arithmetic of what she had and what she needed and what the spring required and where the genuine surplus was. She had a third of her supply that was honestly accounted for more than she needed. Not extravagant surplus. She was not a woman of extravagance, had not been for 58 years, would not become one now. But a genuine third potatoes that would not all be eaten before April beans, that would outlast the winter with jars remaining salt pork, she could cut from without compromising the rest of the ham. She packed a wooden crate. She carried it herself up the slope and along the creek path to the Pruitt place, set it on the doorstep and knocked. When Nora opened the door, Cora set the crate inside without ceremony. "I have more than I need," Cora said. "I'll have more again in June." Nora looked at the crate, the firm, unsprouted potatoes, the January sauerkraut, the salt pork wrapped in cloth. She pressed her lips together the way a person presses their lips together when they are managing an emotion that does not have a clean outlet and they are too proud to let it out in front of a neighbor. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Cora said. "Plant more beans in June." She walked home. Gideon Pruitt told 3 people about it, not because he was indiscreet, he was one of the more careful-spoken men in the county, but because what he told was not gossip. It was something more substantive than gossip. It was a report on what kind of person Cordelia Vance was, delivered in the specific form that reports of this kind take in communities where survival depends on knowing who can be counted on. He told 3 people, and those 3 people told 3 more, and what moved through the county was not the story of the cellar kitchen people had been discussing, that for over a year in one form or another, but the story of what the cellar kitchen produced and what was done with what it produced, which were 2 different stories. And the second one was the more important. There are people who have because they are careful. There are people who have because they were lucky. And there are people who have because they have taken from others what was available to be taken. A community that depends on the land for survival develops over time the ability to sort these categories with reasonable accuracy because the sorting matters. What Gideon Pruitt was saying to three people quietly in the way of a man reporting something he had verified himself was that Cordelia Vance was careful in ways that exceeded ordinary caution, and that what her caution produced was something she shared. That combination moved an opinion. By the end of February, the county's category for Cora Vance had shifted. Not dramatically, there was no announcement, no event that marked the change. It was the kind of shift that happens over many small moments until the accumulated weight of them tips from one side to the other. She was no longer the widow who had gone strange. She was something else, a term not yet agreed upon, but something that meant worth listening to, worth the walk down the hillside to the stone door. Harlan Briggs still held his opinion. But the audience, his opinion, required the nodding agreement of men who accepted what he said, because he was the person who generally said things had begun to look elsewhere for its sense of what was true. He noticed it obliquely, the way you notice a change in the quality of light before you identify that the season has shifted. He could not have named it precisely. He would have denied it if asked. But it was happening in some part of him, the part that had been running a general store and reading a community for 19 years registered it. And somewhere in the limestone and the earth beneath the low hill, the underground kitchen held its 47 degrees and the stovepipe drew twice a day, and the sauerkraut in the cold zone was now more than a year old and had never tasted anything but exactly what properly fermented sauerkraut at a consistent 48 degrees should taste like. And the system that Cordelia Vance had built from necessity and limestone and a cast iron stove and the oldest refrigerator in the world continued to function with the quiet, undemonstrative reliability of something built on correct principles and given room to work. Spring of 1886 came slowly, as if the land was not certain it trusted the warming and was moving toward it with caution. The creek dropped. The mud season ran its necessary and disagreeable course. The garden prepared itself. Cora stood at the cellar door on a warm April morning and looked up the slope at the hillside above her. The 2 feet of earth and clay and limestone above the oak beams. The stovepipe standing quiet in the morning air. The south-facing stone entrance warm in the first hour of sunlight. Next winter would be worse. She did not know this rationally. She knew it the way she knew things that came from accumulated observation, rather than from reasoning from the geese, from the oak bark, from the way the creek had run all spring with a volume that spoke of more snowmelt than usual, from the northern highlands, which meant more cold had been stored there, going into the summer, which meant the hills would begin their autumn cooling from a lower starting point. She began preparing in May. She expanded the shelving in the cold zone. She ordered additional stovepipe from a hardware supplier in West Plains rather than from Calder's Crossing, 2 days ride east, where no one held opinions about her kitchen or expected her to account for her decisions. She put up 30 quarts of beans instead of 12. She hung 2 hams in the coal corner instead of 1. She packed additional boxes of potatoes with twice the straw. She prepared for the worst winter she could imagine. The worst winter she could imagine turned out when it came to be an underestimate. The winter of 1886 to 87 descended on the Ozark Hills in late November with a violence the county had not seen in a decade and did not forget for a generation. The old people would talk about it for the rest of their lives, not because it was the only hard winter they had lived through. The Ozarks delivered hard winters with regularity, but because of the particular form its hardness took, which was more destructive than simple sustained cold would have been. It did not arrive gradually. It did not offer the usual pattern of cold snaps and mild intervals that gave farming families time to assess their situations and make adjustments before the next assault. It arrived on the 22nd of November as a single sustained event, a temperature drop that reached 4 degrees above zero by nightfall and did not release its hold until the last week of March, a stretch of 4 months during which the thermometer at the general store in Calder's Crossing recorded only 11 days above freezing, and those 11 days were the worst part of the winter. The problem with the 11 warm days was what came after them. When temperatures that have been below zero for weeks briefly rise above freezing water that has been locked solid begins to release. Barrels and troughs that have been iced through their full depth begin to soften at the edges. Wood that has contracted in the sustained cold begins to expand back toward its summer dimensions. Stone that has held itself together through dry freeze absorbs the brief moisture and then freezes again when the cold returns, and the expansion of that absorbed water is indifferent to the integrity of whatever is containing it. The freeze-thaw cycle is more destructive than either freeze or thaw alone because it adds mechanical force to temperature, the ice inside the material, expanding with the pressure that stone and wood and poorly built structures cannot contain indefinitely. The structures of the county bore the consequence. The Aldrich smokehouse collapsed on the 17th of January. Harlan Briggs had advised them after the previous year's roof loss to rebuild it wider and deeper, more substantial, he had said, more resistance to the weather. The new structure was larger than the old one, which meant more surface area exposed to the freeze-thaw cycle, which meant more movement in the frame with each temperature swing, which meant the corner joints were working against each other every time the temperature changed. And on the 17th of January, they failed simultaneously at three corners and the walls came down together. 3 months of smoked pork and 2 months of dried sausage went into the snow. The Aldriches recovered most of it, but the exposure had done what exposure does, and the gray-green patches they were trimming from the surface of the meat by February told them what could not be recovered. The Mossberg brothers lost their spring house. The north wall, which had stood for 20 years, heaved outward in the third freeze-thaw cycle of January, the limestone absorbing moisture from the brief thaws and then expanding in the returns of the cold, until the wall's mortar failed along a line from foundation to lintel, and the wall cracked and buckled outward, and the cold that rushed through the gap finished what the crack had started. 24 jars shattered. A winter's worth of butter and stored milk ruined. A structure that had been adequate for 20 years was not adequate for this winter because this winter was not asking for adequacy. 3 other families in the county lost significant portions of their winter food to the cold. Not everything, not the absolute bottom, but enough that February became a month of strict accounting and deliberate reduction of eating the compromised stores first and conserving the sound ones, and calculating in the second week of February whether the arithmetic of what remained against what was still needed would work out by spring. For most of them, it did not quite work out. In the root cellar beneath the low hill on the Vance property, the temperature held at 46 degrees. Not 44, which would have begun to interfere with the chemistry of the fermenting crocks. Not 49, which would have shortened the useful life of the hung pork. 46 degrees consistent across the floor and the walls and the ceiling, and the 4 feet of packed limestone earth above the oak beams, because the geology of the Ozark Hills does not renegotiate its terms for a single hard winter. The cold front that had devastated every above-ground storage structure in the county had not reached the depth where the earth kept its temperature. It could not reach that depth in 4 months. The Earth's thermal mass was too large, its heat too deeply stored, the insulation of rock and soil above the stable zone too effective. Cora had prepared for the worst winter she could imagine. She had 30 quarts of beans on the shelves, 2 hams hanging in the cold corner, approaching their 4th month and darkening to correctly at the exterior, potatoes in 2 straw-lined boxes still firm and dormant, turnips and sand carrots in damp sawdust, a full shelf of dried corn, 3 crocks of sauerkraut deep into their fermentation and developing the clean, sharp, complex flavor that slow, cold fermentation at 47 degrees produces butter and wet cloth in the coldest corner, eggs in the straw baskets. The first winter had taught her that the system worked. The second had taught her how well it worked. This winter was teaching her something else, that there was a category of preparation beyond what most people in the county attempted, and that what separated a person from disaster in a year like this one was not how much food they had managed to accumulate, but how well they had kept what they had. Accumulation was a quantity problem. Keeping was a physics problem. And physics, unlike weather, could be understood and planned for. She cooked 2 meals a day through November, December, January, and February. The stove burned for 90 minutes at breakfast and 2 hours at supper. The cooking zone warmed and the cold zone held its temperature, and the stovepipe drew the combustion gases upward and out through the limestone fissure, and the daily ventilation cycle kept the humidity steady at 70%, and the whole system proceeded with the quiet competence of a thing that has been built on correct principles and given the opportunity to demonstrate them. Outside, the county struggled in ways that were visible from the hilltop, when the weather permitted standing outside long enough to look. Inside the hill, the potatoes were as firm as October. The first week of February brought the storm that closed the roads. Not drifted roads, the kind that can be opened with work and time. Ice roads. The kind that form when freezing rain comes down on top of existing snow and locks everything into a single continuous glaze that is neither ice nor snow, but something in between, something that breaks unpredictably under weight and sends horses sliding sideways toward whatever obstacle lies in the direction of gravity. The road to Calder's Crossing was impassable from the 3rd of February until the 12th, 9 days during which the county's artery for food and medicine and communication was closed. And families that had been managing on reduced stores found themselves managing on reduced stores with no prospect of resupply until the ice broke. Harlan Briggs knew this. He sat in the back room of his general store in the first week of February with his accounts open and his lamp burning, and thought about the county he had served for 19 years. He thought about his family, Willa, and his grown children who had come home for the winter, both of them with children of their own, 4 grandchildren in the house above the store, and he did the arithmetic that every family in the county was doing that week, because the arithmetic was the only real question. What was left, what was needed, and did one exceed the other? His arithmetic was better than most. He had a store. He would not starve. But his arithmetic had a problem he had not anticipated, because the problem was not in the store. It was in the house. The root vegetable pantry in the cellar beneath the house had failed in the 3rd freeze-thaw cycle of January. The north wall of that cellar, which faced the alley behind the store, had never been properly insulated, a fact that had not mattered in 11 previous winters, because those winters had not put the sustained pressure on it that this one had. The temperature swings of January had worked on that wall, the way they had worked on every inadequately insulated structure in the county, and by the first week of February, the potatoes that had gone in sound in October were soft and gray and sprouting in the dark, and the turnips had frozen and thawed twice and gone the color and consistency of wet paper, and the carrots were gone entirely. He had the store. His family would eat, but the good food, the real winter food, the food that represented the labor of the summer and the planning of the autumn, was gone. What remained was provisions, which was a different thing. Salt pork at 12 cents a pound, dried beans in barrels, cornmeal in sacks. Survivable. Not the same. He sat with his lamp and his accounts, and he thought about Cordelia Vance. He had not allowed himself to think about Cordelia Vance directly for nearly a year. Not since the previous spring, when he had overheard Gideon Pruitt speaking about her to 2 men outside the feed store with a tone of respect that Harlan had recognized and not liked. He had filed the recognition away and moved past it without examining it, the way a man moves past an unpleasant fact when he is not yet ready to account for what it means. Now in the back room with the lamp and the soft potatoes and the road closed for 9 days in every direction, he was ready. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in December of 1884 when he had stood at his counter in front of 6 men and said that the widow Vance would be poisoned by February, that the smoke would fill the space and the heat would rot her food. He had been wrong about the smoke and wrong about the heat and wrong about the food and wrong about February, and he had been wrong in public in front of people who had remembered it and repeated it. And by this point in the winter of 1886 to 87, the people who had been paying attention had formed an opinion about who had been right and who had been wrong, and they were maintaining that opinion politely in his presence with the specific, careful courtesy that is extended to a man who has authority but has lost credibility, the loneliest courtesy there is, because it is offered precisely where honesty has been withdrawn. He was 65 years old. He had been in the Ozarks his whole life. He had been the person most consulted in his county for 19 years, and he had offered his consultations with the confidence of someone who had never seriously been wrong about anything important, and he had just spent a hard winter being wrong about the most important practical question his county faced, which was how to keep food through a Missouri winter. 9 miles away, in a hole in the side of a hill that he had called a badger's burrow, in front of 6 witnesses, a 58-year-old widow on a 40-acre farm with $14 had prepared correctly and was eating well. He blew out the lamp. He went to bed. He came on a Tuesday, not with Willa, not with his son or daughter or the 4 grandchildren staying in the house that winter. Alone. This is the detail that Willa would carry for years and describe to Cora on a warm April afternoon on the hillside. Not what Harlan ate, not what he said, not the look on his face when he tasted the bread, but the specific fact of his coming alone. Alone at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in 8-degree weather on a road that was still ice from the storm, riding 9 miles in the dark with a lantern held low against the horse's neck to show the road. He came down the slope to the cellar door. Not to the cabin. He had passed the cabin on the way and kept going down the hill, finding the path by the lantern light, and stopped at the stone-framed entrance and knocked on the 2-inch oak plank. Cora was inside. She had banked the evening fire an hour before and was sitting in the cooling cooking zone with a candle and the accounts she kept what remained in the cellar, what had been used, what the spring would require, the calculations she made every February to confirm what she already knew. She heard the knock. She set down her pencil. She knew who it was. Not rationally, there was no rational basis 9 miles from Calder's Crossing on a Tuesday night in 8 degrees on ice roads. She knew it the way you know things that have been approaching for a long time and have finally arrived at the point where they cannot be deferred any further. She stood and smoothed her apron and opened the door. Harlan Briggs was standing in the dark with his lantern and his white beard, and his pale eyes wearing his good coat and his good boots, and neither the coat nor the boots had been sufficient for 9 miles in 8-degree weather, and he was cold in the specific way that a man is cold when he has been cold for too long, and is trying very hard not to show it, because showing it would require admitting something about the circumstances that brought him here. He said, "The grandchildren haven't eaten since this morning." Not a preamble, not an explanation, not the apology that the situation technically called for and that he did not have the architecture for. Just the fact, the one true thing stripped of everything that was not essential, which is how a man who has been wrong for a long time and finally knows it speaks when he has run out of room for anything except honesty. Cora looked at him. She had known men like Harlan Briggs her whole life. Not bad men, not dishonest men in the deliberate sense, but men who had built their identities on the foundation of never being wrong in a public setting. Men for whom an acknowledged error was not just an intellectual admission, but a structural event, something that threatened the whole edifice of what they were. She understood what it had cost him to ride 9 miles in 8 degrees and knock on this particular door. She understood it exactly with the precision of someone who does not need to forgive a debt she was never required to carry. "Come in," she said. She put him on the wooden bench in the cooking zone and built the fire back from the banked coals with the practiced efficiency of someone who has started fires twice a day for 2 years and does not think about the process anymore. She added wood and let the fire take hold and set a pot on the stove and went to the cold zone. She made potato soup. The potatoes she cut from were 4 months old and as firm as the day she had packed them in straw in October, dense and starchy and dry-fleshed, with none of the soft sweetness that compromised potatoes, developed none of the gray at the flesh that announced cellular damage. She rendered a piece of salt pork in the pot, first the fat going clear and fragrant, and added dried onions soaked briefly in water, and then the cut potatoes in water and salt, and the last of the thyme from the drying string above the stove, and put the lid on and let it work. The smell filled the cellar. It was not the smell of an emergency kitchen or a survival kitchen, the smell of food made from what was left rather than from what was chosen. It was the smell of a kitchen that had what it needed and knew what to do with it. The fat and onion in the hot iron, the starch releasing slowly into the broth, the thyme dispersing into the steam carrying it through the warm zone and into the cold zone where it mixed with the 46-degree air and the mineral character of the limestone walls and the faint sweetness of the sauerkraut and became something that smelled like specifically supper, not survival, not emergency, but supper in a kitchen that had been running correctly all winter. Harlan Briggs sat on the wooden bench and the smell found him and something changed in his face. Not dramatically, dynamically, not in a way that someone not watching carefully would have noticed. The held quality released the specific tension of a man who has been managing an equation that does not balance for a very long time and has finally, in cold and exhaustion, in the 9-mile acknowledgement of being wrong, stopped managing it. Cora set the bowl in front of him. She had sliced bread from the Sunday loaf risen on the warm counter beside the stove baked in the oven, the crust hard and the crumb open, and the smell of it something that Sunday morning bread always smells like when it is made correctly. She set a crock of butter beside the bowl. November butter packed in wet cloth, 45 degrees, for 3 months, tasting still of what it had been when the cow last walked on grass that had not yet frozen. He ate. Cora sat at the other end of the bench with her own bowl and they ate without speaking, the fire settling, and the cold zone holding its temperature beyond the invisible line where warmth ended, and outside 8 degrees and ice for 9 miles in every direction, and the hard stars of a winter sky that had given up nothing. Harlan ate the best meal he had eaten since October. He finished the soup and mopped the bowl with the bread, and set the bowl down and looked at the limestone wall across from him. Then he looked at the hung ham in the corner. Dark at the rind pale, at the cut face where she had sliced it, the fat white and firm, the lean a deep rose color, that meant the curing had proceeded as it should. The pork, he said, that's from autumn. September, Cora said. He was calculating. 5 months. 5 months in a hole in the ground, and the color was still right, and the smell was clean, and the soup had tasted like supper in a house that was running well, not like the managed adequacy of a kitchen that was making do with what the winter had left it. How do you keep the humidity right? He asked. The question surprised her, not the fact of it, which she had expected eventually from someone, but the specificity of it. He had arrived at the most sophisticated variable in the system, the one she had not designed for and had discovered by accident and then exploited deliberately. He had been a hardware and provisions man for 19 years. He knew what humidity did to stored food. He had come at the right question from a different direction than she had, but he had come to it. She explained the draw, the convection cycle, the warm air carrying moisture out through the pipe, the cool dry air settling back, and the twice-daily ventilation exchange that maintained the cold zone's humidity at 70% without any active management. She told him what she had found on the 4th day of January, in the first winter, the 4-day-old milk that was still sweet, and how that observation had led her to understand what the stove was doing to the air, as well as the temperature. He listened without the forward lean of someone waiting for the point where the explanation could be challenged. He listened the way a person listens when the information matters more than who is delivering it. You found the fissure before you put the pipe in, he said. I looked for it. Most people wouldn't have known to look. Most people hadn't found the burned wood, Cora said. He looked at her. She told him about the iron hook, the charred fragment, the evidence of the person who had tried before her, and stopped at the smoke problem. She told him about the questions she had asked herself. Why did they give up? What did they miss? And how the answer to that question had told her what she needed to know about what she needed to solve. Harlan was quiet for a moment. The stove settled. The cold zone breathed. Who was it, he asked, who tried before you? I don't know, Cora said. They didn't leave a name, just the hook. He nodded slowly. Outside, the temperature dropped another degree, and the stars wheeled their indifferent arc over the Ozark Hills, and two people who had been on opposite sides of a judgment for 2 years sat in an underground kitchen and talked about humidity and flues and the correct temperature for cured pork. Not about who had been right, not about what had been said at the store counter in December of 1884 in front of 6 men who had remembered it and repeated it. Not about the long cost of a certainty maintained past the point where the evidence supported it. Those things were in the room. They were always in the room when two people share a history like theirs, but they were not spoken because neither of them needed to speak them, and because the bowl that sat between them on the wooden bench had already said more than words would have added. Willa brought the grandchildren the following afternoon. She arrived with the knock of someone who has been here before and knows she is welcome, and Cora opened the door to find her with 2 grandchildren, the older one 8 years old with his grandfather's pale eyes, the younger one 5 and wrapped in so much coat and muffler that only her eyes were visible between the wool. Willa's face carried the expression of a woman who has arranged things precisely and is not going to explain the arrangement more than necessary. Harlan said the road's a little better, Willa said. It's better, Cora agreed. Come in. They came in. The children stood in the warm end of the cellar and looked at everything, the shelves and the crocks and the hung meats and the strings of dried apple and braided onions and the dried apples strung from the ceiling joists with the comprehensive attention of children who have been cold and are now warm and are in a room full of food and are processing the combination. The older boy looked at it all with the systematic, cataloging attention of someone taking inventory. It's like a store, he said. It's like a house, Cora said. The kind of house you can eat. She cooked supper for all of them. The previous night's soup made larger cornbread in the oven. The oldest sauerkraut crock opened and ladled into a bowl butter on the board. They ate at the wooden counter, all five of them, the fire warm at their backs and the cold zone holding its quiet temperature in front of them, and the lamplight on the limestone walls making the underground room look for the length of that supper, like exactly what it was, a kitchen that worked. Not a makeshift arrangement or a widow's emergency solution or a hole in the ground with pretensions. A kitchen thought through and built well and run correctly, and the food that came out of it showed the quality of things made in alignment with how they should be made. Harlan sat at the end of the counter and ate his second bowl of soup from the cellar in 2 days and said very little. The grandchildren said enough for everyone. "Why is it cold over there but warm here?" the 5-year-old asked, pointing toward the invisible line between the zones. "The warm end is for cooking," Cora said. "The cold end is for keeping." "Keeping what and everything?" The girl thought about this with the serious expression of a child working out something that matters. "Like a big jar," she said. "Like a big jar," Cora agreed. Willa looked at her husband. He was looking at the cold zone, at the shelves in the organized rows of crocks and baskets and boxes, at the preserved things that had held their quality through the worst winter in 10 years, at the ham in the corner that had been hanging since September and was still right. He was looking at it the way a person looks at something that has worked when they predicted it would not, which requires a different quality of attention than ordinary looking. Because what you are doing is not just observing the thing, but revising the internal map that told you it could not work. And that revision done honestly takes a moment. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say he had been wrong. He was 65 years old, and the habit of certainty was too deeply grooved in him to break cleanly at a supper table in February. But he looked at the shelves with the genuine attention of someone who was actually seeing what was in front of him, perhaps for the first time since December of 1884, and Willa saw him do it, and Cora saw Willa see him, and that was enough. It was the whole exchange conducted without words in the lamplight of an underground kitchen, and it did not require anything further. Willa was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Cora with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. "I owe you something," Willa said. "I should have spoken up a year ago." Cora shook her head. "You came when you came," she said. That was enough. Harlan set down his spoon and looked at the fire in the stove. "The humidity," he said after a moment. "That's the part most people will miss." "Most people will," Cora agreed. "You'd need to explain it." "I intend to." They finished supper in the way of people who have said the main thing, if not in so many words, and can now be quiet together without the quiet being uncomfortable. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, and the stars were coming out hard over the Ozark Hills, and the road to Calder's Crossing was still ice, but would be less ice tomorrow. And there was soup to finish, and bread to eat, and butter on the board that tasted like September clover, and the 5-year-old had fallen asleep against her grandmother's arm, and the fire ticked steadily in the stove, and the cold zone held as 46 degrees in the dark beyond the warm end, patient and undemanding, and exactly as reliable as the earth that housed it. Spring came in the second week of March, tentatively at first, and then with conviction. The ice released from the roads over the course of 3 days, the process working from the sun-exposed stretches first and moving into the shaded sections last, until the road to Calder's Crossing was passable, and then muddy, and then as April dried the clay solid again. The creek ran fast and high with snowmelt, and turned the red of the clay hills before clearing to the limestone green of late spring. The red bud in the creek hollow came out 2 weeks late, but came out all at once, and the hillsides, which had been brown and gray since November, went green so quickly that you could almost watch it happen if you stood still long enough. Cora took stock in April. The potatoes were still firm. She had eaten from them through the entire winter and still had a third of the original boxes remaining at the end of March, firm edible good, which was something that should not have been possible and was. The second ham was approaching its 7th month and would be excellent through May and sound through June. The sauerkraut crocks held their last contents without any compromise. The dried beans and corn in their cloth bags on the back shelf were untouched. She had not merely survived the worst winter in a decade. She had ended it with food remaining. By May, something was happening in the county that had no formal announcement because it did not require one. Gideon Pruitt came in late April when he returned the wooden crate she had packed for his family in January. He sat on the stone outside the cellar door in the warm spring afternoon and asked whether she would walk him through the stovepipe installation, how she had found the fissure, how she had sealed the joint, how she had determined the placement of the cooking zone and the cold zone. He was planning to dig a proper root cellar that summer, a combined kitchen and cold storage, and he wanted to understand the principles before he started digging. She showed him. She walked him through every element of what she had built and why the way she had tapped the ceiling to find the fissure, the clay mixture for the seal, the limestone platform for thermal mass, the shelf arrangement for air circulation, the daily fire cycle, and what it did to humidity, the specific temperatures she had observed in each zone and what those temperatures were good for. She told him about the burned wood and the iron hook and the person who had tried before her and failed at the smoke problem, because that story was part of the answer to why the system worked, not just what she had done, but what she had understood before she did it. He listened with the complete attention of a man who is building what he hears directly into a concrete plan. 3 other families came before summer was out. The Aldriches in June, whose smokehouse collapse had finally resolved the question of where their food should be stored in winter. A family named Whitmore in July, who had lost their spring house to the ice and were looking for an arrangement less dependent on above-ground structures that the weather could reach. 2 more families before the first frost of autumn. By August, 4 families in the county had begun digging cellars designed from the start as combined kitchens and cold storage, following the layout that Cora walked them through with the patience and precision of someone who has thought carefully about something for 3 years and knows every part of it well enough to teach it. By summer 4, families in the county had begun digging. They came to her one by one, the Aldriches in June, the Whitmores in July, 2 more before the first frost. She showed each of them the same things: where to look for the fissure, how to mix the clay seal, why the platform mattered, how to read the humidity by the feel of the wall. The knowledge moved outward the way knowledge moves when it is practical and freely given person to person, season to season, without ceremony, and without anyone needing to announce that something had changed. It was Willa who told her about the stovepipe. They were sitting on the hillside above the cellar on an afternoon in April of 1887, the new grass coming in soft around them, and the dogwood in the creek hollow just beginning to open its white flowers, and the particular quality of Ozark spring light on the limestone hillside, making everything look as though it had been washed clean while nobody was watching. They had 10 cups of tea and the easy silence of women who have come to know each other through a hard winter and no longer require conversation to fill the space between them. He ordered stovepipe, Willa said. From the catalog, a full case. Cora looked at her. He told the Aldrich boy it was because underground kitchens were becoming popular in the district and a well-stocked general store would do right to have the parts on hand. Willa turned her tin cup in both hands. He called it a commercial cold room arrangement, said it was a coming thing in the county. Cora was quiet for a moment. He said all of that. He did. Did he say where he had heard about it? He did not, Willa said. He did not say that. There was a pause. The creek ran in the hollow below them. A red-tailed hawk came over the ridgeline to the east and tilted into the thermal above the cleared field and rode it in slow circles, unhurried, the kind of patience available only to something that does not need to be anywhere else. Cora smiled. It was not a complicated smile, not the smile of someone savoring a vindication or recounting a debt that was finally being acknowledged. It was the genuine smile of someone who has understood something and found it more interesting than it is infuriating. The kind of smile that starts at the mouth and reaches the eyes and stays there without calculation. She had been right. The county knew she had been right. The 4 families digging cellars knew. Gideon and Nora Pruitt knew and knew who they had to thank, and had said so in the way of people who do not have the exactly right words, but mean what they mean with everything they have. And Harlan Briggs, who had stood at his counter in December of 1884 and told 6 men in the county through them that the Widow Vance would be poisoned by February, had ordered a case of stovepipe from the catalog and was calling it a commercial cold room arrangement that a well-stocked store would do right to carry. He had not said her name. He did not need to. Everyone already knew. And this Cora understood. Sitting on the warm limestone hillside with her tea was actually funnier than it was infuriating. The one thing Harlan could not do, could not constitutionally in the structure of who he was and had been for 65 years, was the one thing that would have cost him almost nothing compared to what being wrong had already cost him. He could have said the name. He could have said the widow Vance figured something out and she was right and I was wrong, and here is what she figured out. That was all it would have taken. 6 words of honesty at the front door. Instead, he had arrived at the only other path available to him, which was to sell the idea without the source to make the correct thing into a commercial opportunity, to absorb the lesson through the back entrance of inventory rather than the front entrance of acknowledgement. This was exactly as funny as it was. "He'll do well with the stovepipe," Cora said. "He'll do very well," Willa agreed. They sat in the spring afternoon on the limestone hillside and drank their tea while the creek ran in the hollow and the hawk circled on the thermal and the dogwood opened its white flowers in the shade below them. Cordelia Vance lived on the 40 acres for 22 years after that first November, when she had moved the cast iron stove down the hill in pieces and assembled it against the back wall of the root cellar and sealed the stovepipe through the limestone fissure and built her first fire. She expanded the cold zone in the summer of 1888, widening it by 4 feet on the north side and adding 2 more shelves to accommodate the additional preservation capacity she needed after her second cow came into production and her henhouse doubled in size. The expansion took her 3 weeks of work done in the cool of the morning. In the evening, the limestone blocks sourced from the creek bed, the way she had sourced everything herself one at a time, carried up the slope on a sled she had built from fence rails. She improved the cabin, new chinking in the autumn of 1889, mixed and applied herself over 3 days, the old dried material chipped out and fresh packed in, while the weather was still warm enough for it to cure properly. A new roof in 1890 shingles, she had split herself from a red oak that had come down in the east woodlot during a storm, hauled up and cut to length and laid in overlapping courses on a still October day. The leaks in the sleeping area finally addressed 4 years after Amos had first planned to do it. A proper wooden floor in 1892 to replace the planks that had been separating since the year before he died. Tongue and groove oak fitted tight and pegged level and solid in a way the old floor had never been. She planted the orchard she had been planting since the first autumn after Amos's death. 7 apple trees and 4 pear trees on the south slope, placed where the hillside caught the most sun, and the limestone substrate below held the warmth into late autumn and kept the ground from freezing as early as the creek hollow below. She chose her varieties with the same care she had chosen everything: late-keeping apples for the cellar, early ripeners for eating fresh, and putting up before the cellar needed to hold them. The first trees bore in 1888. By 1892, she was putting up more apple preserves than she could use in a winter and finding homes for the surplus, with the Pruitts and the Aldriches and the Whitmores, who had learned by then to accept surplus from Cora Vance's cellar without making too much of it. She acquired a second cow, built a proper henhouse, expanded the garden to twice its original size. She learned over the course of several seasons of careful attention to what the cellar showed her, which varieties kept best at 46 degrees, the late-season potatoes over the early ones, the dense-headed cabbages over the loose, the dry-cured hams over the green, the full sour fermented beans over the quick pickled. She learned these things the same way she had learned everything about the underground kitchen, by doing them and observing what happened and adjusting what the observation required. Not from a book, not from instruction. From the practice of paying close attention to the evidence and being willing to revise what the evidence contradicted. The farm became, over those 22 years, something beyond what 40 Ozark acres and a widowed woman with $14 had any predictable right to become. Not prosperous in the way of people who had land enough and luck enough and weather cooperating. Prosperous in a different and more reliable way. Prosperous in the way of something that has been built on correct principles and given time to demonstrate them. The root cellar at the center of everything. The kitchen that was also a cold room. The food that lasted not because the winter had been kind, but because the system that held the food answered to the earth's physics rather than to the weather's mood. On a morning in October of 1906, the autumn she turned 73, Cordelia Vance stood at the cellar door in the early light and looked up at the hillside above her. The 2 feet of earth and clay above the oak beams, the stovepipe standing in the cold morning air, the iron cold and gray in the flat light before the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. The south-facing stone entrance warming in the first direct sunlight of the day, the limestone holding the warmth the way limestone holds everything. It is given slowly, steadily, for longer than you would expect. She had built this in 3 days in November of 1884. She had been 58 years old, a widow of 4 months, with $14 and 40 acres, and an idea worked out from a charred piece of wood and an iron hook and a crack in the limestone ceiling of a room that everyone else on the property for the previous 40 years had used for only one purpose. The idea had been simple in the way that ideas are simple when they are correct. Not easy. Nothing about those 3 days of moving a cast iron stove piece by piece down a hillside had been easy, and nothing about the first winter of learning what the system could and couldn't do had been without effort. But simple. The kind of simplicity that is on the other side of complexity that you find after you have understood the problem well enough to see what it actually requires. The earth is cold. The fire is warm. Put the fire at one end and the cold at the other, and the cold will stay cold, and the fire will come and go, and what you store in the cold will keep, and what you cook at the fire will nourish you, and the whole system will ask nothing from you but the understanding to build it right and the firewood to run it. She had understood it. She had built it right. She had run it for 22 years on those two inputs, understanding and firewood, and the 40 acres had fed her through every winter the sky had sent, including the worst one in a decade, and she had ended each winter with food remaining, which was the measure she had set for herself in October of 1884, when she stood in the doorway of the empty root cellar and asked whether it could be more than what it was. Below her in the limestone and the packed earth and the dark, the cold zone held its 46 degrees. The stovepipe stood ready. The shelves inside waited for the autumn's harvest to arrive and take its place. The oldest refrigerator in the world, the one that had been there before anyone living had thought to use it as more than a hole for potatoes, doing what it had always done. Holding the cold, holding the temperature, holding everything entrusted to it at exactly the degree the earth decided, and not a degree more or less. Nimrose. She had asked a question of it that nobody had asked before. It had answered. The earth is cold, the fire is warm, and a woman who understands both can feed herself through any winter the sky decides to send.